the Cognitive Development Society, actually a few years back, had a special session on how do you teach children evolution. Because it's widely understood that children, first of all, see all of this design and purpose, and when they're taught that natural selection is not purposeful, it's not a designing kind of process in the strict sense, that runs against their intuitions, and so it creates a barrier for them to understand how evolution works. Further, they tend towards species essentialism, thinking that different natural kinds have strict boundaries, okay, so that the idea of one animal being the ancestor of another, one species being ancestral to another species doesn't make sense. Deep time is difficult. There are all kinds of difficult concepts in evolution for children. So it's not a surprise then that Margaret Evans from University of Michigan found, looking at American children, that even if their parents and their schools were teaching evolutionary origins for different kinds of animals, or evolutionary explanations for features of animals, that children didn't start adopting evolutionary explanations themselves until they're about 10 or 11 years old. Okay, before that, regardless of what their parents and schools are teaching, they tend toward creationist explanations, or even spontaneous generation explanations ahead of evolutionary explanations. Okay, stuff just popped into existence. So it's really difficult then, because of these natural tendencies and these sort of reasoning biases, for children to understand this progression. That's a joke, by the way.
Well, this evening it's really a great privilege to welcome Professor Justin Barrett, who's Professor of Development Science and also Director of the Thrive Center for Human Development at Fuller Theological Seminary, which is in Pasadena, California, if you're not familiar with that. And he's located there in the Seminary School of Psychology. Professor Barrett was previously, most recently in Oxford for 5 years, lecturing there in the School of Anthropology. He's widely regarded as one of the founders of the rather new cognitive science of religion field, and you will find a couple of his books on the bookstall. One is called Why Would Anyone Believe in God? Good question. And this one's called Born Believers. So 2 books, both quite recent, and I hope you'll take a look at those and other books on the bookstall. But we're delighted he's come all the way to come and speak to us this evening on this topic, Are People Born to Believe? So perhaps we can give a good warm welcome to Professor Barrett. Thank you.
Does anybody know what this is? You recognize this kind of thing? The shape sorter, that's right. So this is, actually this one is rated to 12 months and older. So it's a preschool toy, and you find these little shapes and figure out which one it goes in, kind of thing, right? And so let's see if I can pass this little test here. Triangular one goes in the triangle slot, and star-shaped one goes there. And let's see, I've got this pentagonal thing go here. And I'm not just showing you this because I want to impress you with my visuospatial abilities, but rather because I think it's a really nice metaphor for my primary thesis. And that is that by virtue of the way human minds naturally develop in ordinary human environments, we end up developing sort of conceptual spaces, if you will. Little gaps of different shapes that then sort of neatly can be fit with information in the cultural environment. And I'm going to argue that one of the shapes that we have is actually sort of God-shaped, little g, God-shaped, conceptual space that then looks for something in the cultural environment to fill that space, or not. If it's not filled, that would cause some angst, but it'll be filled out. And one of the important things about this little metaphor, I guess, is it doesn't matter what color this is, right? It could be green, it could be red, it could be purple, it doesn't matter. What matters is that it fits the conceptual space the right way. So I want to suggest to you that we have evidence that from childhood, children develop a conceptual space that's neatly fit with a God concept. And many different God concepts can fill that space if it has the right conceptual shape. Okay? And so that has led me to argue in this book that children are born believers. This is a different issue than whether they're born to believe. I'll return to that at the end. But first I want to address, are children born believers? And what do I mean by that? Well, you probably heard the phrase that somebody is, say, a born athlete, or a born basketball player, born singer, a born artist. And surely what we mean by that colloquialism is not that the child in question comes out of the womb with a perfect turnaround jump shot, or painting, or singing. Squalling, perhaps, but not singing. What we mean when someone is a born athlete is that because of their natural endowment, there's a squeaky spot on the floor, sorry. Over here. Because of their natural endowment, all they need is minimal sort of encouragement by the environment they're in to really excel in that area. Let me suggest that in a similar kind of way, nearly all humans are born believers. That is, by virtue of the ordinary endowment we have as human beings living in ordinary human environments, it takes very little for us to become religious. Okay? That's the path of least resistance. You might wonder at this, because I think typically when we're thinking about child development, when we think about parenting or educating our children in education, our focus is on their amazing plasticity, and it seems like they're almost a blank slate just waiting to be written upon. But cognitive developmental psychology seems to suggest a different story. That is, that we have natural predispositions that make some forms of thinking easier than others. And I'll come back around to that and give you a little bit of evidence for why we might think that. But let me start with a little story. A couple of years ago, I was at a conference, and a developmental psychologist, colleague of mine living in what by some measures is the most secular country on earth, who was an atheist, he and his wife both atheists, raising their daughter as an atheist, shared with me that when his daughter was 3 years old, she walked up to him and explained that God was everywhere all the time. Now, he was astounded by this pronouncement. First of all, it's not what you expect to come out of a 3-year-old. But also, here I am in a secular country, raising my daughter as an atheist, and she's saying that God is everywhere all the time. Now, he interrogated this a bit and tried to figure out where she caught this concept and just couldn't figure it out. And at least when I spoke to him, this was a couple of years later, the child still persisted in believing that God was everywhere all the time, but had added the feature that she was also an elderly woman. Okay? God was an elderly woman. Now, that's an important little detail, because it's extremely unlikely that somebody, behind the backs of the parents was, pulling the child aside and saying, God's everywhere all the time, and she's a woman. And indoctrinating this child. That's not the right story, I think, to explain why children seem to pick up on religious concepts so easily. These photos are from a study by Andrew Meltzoff when he was at Oxford. And this is one of my favorite illustrations of children's natural propensities to process certain kinds of information in certain ways over others, and even kind of in an aggressive fashion. So we've got newborn infants here. Meltzoff and his collaborator Moore have done work with babies as young as about 6 hours old, okay, entire studies with babies less than 24 hours old. And what you're seeing here is experimenters sticking out tongue, infants sticking out tongue, open mouth, pursed lips. Babies, newborns, can imitate facial expressions, and not just rude ones, it turns out. But it is a narrow band. I mean, they can't do crazy stuff like that, but a few different expressions they can do. And this is really, I think, a fantastic kind of ability that they have, because apparently they, first of all, are selectively attending to faces in their environment. We know that infants are sort of scanning the environment, and they are attracted to human faces from birth. They are selectively attending to those, and then they're somehow mapping this visual information onto their own musculature to create these expressions before they even know that they have a face. Right? There's something very natural and automatic at birth to attend to faces and imitate facial expressions. That's pretty cool, okay? Turns out there are all kinds of things that babies maybe not have necessarily fresh out of the womb like this, but certainly acquired very early in life. It looks like they might have natural dispositions to acquire certain kinds of thinking in the first few years of life, and this is just a really nice example of that. So my thesis here is that children are born believers in the sense that they develop with propensities to seek meaning in their environments. They tend to believe in a purposeful designed world, and they attach that purpose or that design to a non-human designer who is likely to be super knowing, super perceiving, and immortal from their perspective. Okay? That seems like a lot, doesn't it? Well, how would we know? We certainly aren't going to, I've tried, and I can't get by this an IRB, to develop a colony of babies with control condition and all that. So rather, the research strategy looks much more similar to what psycholinguists in the Chomskyan tradition did when they were starting to study language. You can't find lots of babies who haven't been exposed to language. You can't find babies who haven't been exposed to any supernatural concepts. So what do? You look for ways in which children seem to think in ways under-supported or under-accounted for by cultural input. For instance, holding beliefs that seem to exceed parental commitments in certain ways. See whether such tendencies are simply outgrown or whether they must be tamped down through formal education or intellectual rigor, and identify those general tendencies of minds that conspire to support some ways of thinking and acting over others. Do it early as you can and cross-culturally if possible. Hopefully you'll see shades of this strategy in some of the studies I'm going to present. I'll start with a study by developmental psychologist Deborah Kellerman, who has done most of her work in the UK and in the United States. And she's famous for her work on promiscuous teleology, she's called it. Done dozens of studies on this. Teleology here referring to perceiving design and purpose in the natural world. Okay? Well, design and purpose. Promiscuous in that children are seeing it in places that adults just wouldn't approve of. Okay, they're a little bit liberal about their application of this teleological reasoning, this thinking in terms of design and purpose. Okay, particularly applying it to plants, animals, and even rocks. So I think one of her journal article titles was something like "Why Are the Rocks Pointy?" or something like that. So she's kind of famous for that, so I'll lead with it. She would show children pictures, for instance, of pointy rocks and then ask, why do you think the rocks are so pointy? And children will spontaneously generate answers like, well, they're pointy so that animals wouldn't sit on them and crush them. Okay, so they're pointy for a reason, for a particular function that serves the rocks in this case. Kellerman went on after, in other studies, to then pit different kinds of explanations against each other. So these teleological explanations, like they're pointy so that animals wouldn't sit on them to smash them, versus mechanistic kinds of explanations. Well, they're pointy because bits of stuff piled up on top of one another for a long time. Okay? And then asking children to choose which one is right. And she finds in those studies, children prefer the teleological explanations. Some of you are already thinking, but is there something funny about asking why, and why questions sort of demand teleological responses and so forth? And actually, Kellerman has chased that down. She's tried different kinds of phrasing, and she's also looked at how parents explain things to their kids, how they respond to why questions, and actually, parents rarely give teleological explanations for features of the natural world. Certainly not at the rate that explains her results. Okay? Another study goes this way. Kellerman introduces children to two fictitious characters, Ben and Jane, and then multiple natural kinds of targets as well as artifacts. So different kinds of animals, plants, natural non-living things like clouds and icebergs, but also artifacts, genes, machines, clock hands, and so forth. And the setup goes this way. Okay, this is Ben, and this is Jane. And this is a tiger. So I'll show you a picture of the tiger. And then run through this description of the tiger. Ben thinks that tigers have all kinds of different functions and runs through them. They're for eating, they're for sleeping, they're for being seen at the zoo. They can do lots of things, and that's what they're here for. Okay? That's what Ben thinks, whereas Jane thinks that's silly. Those are things that a tiger can do, runs through the list again. But that's not what they're here for. They can do those things, but that's not what they're here for. Who do you think is right, Ben versus Jane? Okay, and these questions were carefully crafted so that the same verbiage is used by both children. The difference is one is denying it, and one is affirming it. And then the children are simply asked, who's right, Ben or Jane? And it's counterbalanced to make sure, that it's not just we like boys versus girls or the other way around, whichever came first. All that's counterbalanced. And what she's found with these studies is that 4 and 5-year-old children are equally likely to affirm, first of all, they prefer the teleological answers, and they prefer them for, say, animals, about 3/4 of the time, at the same rate that they're judging artifacts to be made for something. So a tiger is just as likely to be made for something as a pair of jeans is, or a chair is. Surely it's not the case that parents are teaching their kids with the same frequency and fervency that tigers are made for something and that's why they're here. Okay? Children just seem to be drawn to these kinds of teleological explanations. In another study of now focusing from just what kinds of features, what accounts for them, to where did certain things come from, Kellerman has asked several kinds of questions. So why did the first ever bird exist? And here are some answers that preschoolers offered. Well, to make nice music, because it makes the world look nice. Why did the first ever monkey exist? Well, so that we had somebody to climb trees, so there can be an animal in the jungle. Why did the first ever river exist? So boats could come in the water so that people could do fishing. Okay? So, you can see here that we want to go fishing and we have these boats, we just need some water, so that's why the first ever river exists. All right? Seems to be the way kids are thinking, right? That the origins of things are accounted for, at least in part, by their purpose, their function. That's why they're here. Same children, follow-up questions. Now, those were open-ended questions. Then Kellerman and Diani followed up with closed-ended questions. So we've been talking about mountain, let's say, or fill in your favorite. Now, here's the question. Did someone or something make the first ever mountain exist, or did it just happen? Okay? So moving from where did it come from to did someone do it? Did someone do it? Or did something do it? Or did it just happen? And these were counterbalanced as well. And what Kellerman found is that for the animals, for the plants, for the natural non-living things, children preferred the someone explanation. That was the typical response. For animals, it got all the way up to 73% of the responses were someone did. Okay, someone brought them about. Only, I think it was for natural events did they not. So that'd be like a thunderstorm. Did they not go to someone did it? All right. So children not only have this tendency to design and to see design or purpose in the natural world and use that to account for things, their origins, they link that design or purpose to a someone having done it. Now, some of you know this is old news to a certain extent. This idea that preschoolers are prone to seeing the world purposely designed as someone, an intelligent, intentional agent behind the natural design, is kind of old news because, well, Piaget said something similar in the 1920s. All right, these are more careful, systematic studies today, but those of you who know your history of psychology might know, well, that's what Piaget thought kids thought too. Okay, so that raises just the question, well, who is the intelligent, intentional agent behind the purpose and design of the natural world? And of course, an easy answer is that it's people. And that was Piaget's answer, is that children thought the natural world, just like the artificial world, was designed by human beings. Okay? So people made Lake Geneva. This has been termed childhood artificialism. Okay? Natural world made by human beings. And that until kids are about 8 or 9 years old, they didn't discriminate between gods, or God, capital G, and humans. God is just the name of another human. Maybe the sort of the boss workman, the foreman of the construction site, but just a human being nonetheless. All right? So, could it be humans? Is that what children are thinking when they say someone did it? Well, it doesn't look that way. More careful systematic studies recently in the past 20 years or so seem to suggest that at least most preschoolers think otherwise. So Susan Gelman from University of Michigan, for instance, asked 4- and 7-year-olds about the same kinds of things that Piaget asked about: suns, oceans, moons, stars, clouds, and simply asked, do you think people made it? And actually, whoops, sorry about that. No, they don't. It was essentially 0 7-year-olds said that people made these things. It was in that sort of noisy area of about 10%, which you get in almost any developmental study. And even a majority of 4-year-olds said, no, absolutely not. That's not right. Subsequent studies have gone on to show, look, by the time kids are 4 years old, most of them have it very clear in their minds. People make chairs, people make buildings, they don't make mountains, they don't make stars, they don't make animals. Okay? So if it's not people, then who? Well, it's pretty obvious that God is a pretty good candidate, but Olivera Petrovich from Oxford followed up just asking kids, 4 years old, in Oxford, was the natural world, various features of it, made by people, was it made by God, or no one knows? Okay, so there were given 3 options there. And she asked about plants, animals, rocks, and even the whole world. Was it made by people, was it made by God, or no one knows? Those were counterbalanced as well. Children were 7 times more likely to say God made the natural objects. Okay? And then that people made it. Right, so it does not look like children are artificialists in the sense, at least not necessarily artificialists in the way that Piaget thought they were. All right? So who designed the natural world? Well, you need something that is powerful enough, has the right kinds of properties to intend things, to have purposes and design. God does that job if God is available to children. God seems like a reasonable, intentional agent behind this design and purpose of the natural world. And in fact, children's natural tendencies toward creationist type of thinking means that one of the sort of upshots of this, among other biases they have, is that learning evolution is very difficult for them. The Cognitive Development Society, actually a few years back, had a special session on how do you teach children evolution. Because it's widely understood that children, first of all, see all of this design and purpose, and when they're taught that natural selection is not purposeful, it's not a designing kind of process in the strict sense, that runs against their intuitions, and so it creates a barrier for them to understand how evolution works. Further, they tend towards species essentialism, thinking that different natural kinds have strict boundaries, okay, so that the idea of one animal being the ancestor of another, one species being ancestral to another species doesn't make sense. Deep time is difficult. There are all kinds of difficult concepts in evolution for children. So it's not a surprise then that Margaret Evans from University of Michigan found, looking at American children, that even if their parents and their schools were teaching evolutionary origins for different kinds of animals, or evolutionary explanations for features of animals, that children didn't start adopting evolutionary explanations themselves until they're about 10 or 11 years old. Okay, before that, regardless of what their parents and schools are teaching, they tend toward creationist explanations, or even spontaneous generation explanations ahead of evolutionary explanations. Okay, stuff just popped into existence. So it's really difficult then, because of these natural tendencies and these sort of reasoning biases, for children to understand this progression. That's a joke, by the way. Turns out this design bias that Kellerman has identified doesn't just go away. We don't just outgrow it. It's always there in the background, it appears. It needs to be tamped down through formal education or some other kinds of enculturation process. So Kellerman has replicated many of these promiscuous teleology studies with either uneducated Roma adults in Romania, and found that they actually perform like children in these tasks. They look like the 8-year-olds in the tasks, affirming teleofunctional kinds of explanations for the natural world at a similar rate as 8-year-olds. Likewise found this in Alzheimer's patients, suggesting to her that maybe promiscuous teleology isn't outgrown, but it's effortlessly overridden. And so really recent studies that she's done, very clever, she's presented a series of explanations for features of natural kinds, and simply asked adults, whether these are good or bad explanations for something. So ferns grow in forests because they provide ground shade. Is that a good explanation of why ferns grow in the forest, or a bad explanation? You don't have to say. I don't want to embarrass anybody here, but that would, most people would say, well, actually, no, that's a bad explanation for why they grow there. They happen to provide ground shade, but that's not why they grow there, right? That'd be giving a teleological explanation. Earthworms tunnel underground to aerate the soil. Well, they happen to aerate the soil, but that's not why they're tunneling, right? Okay, and if you give university science-educated adults all the time they want to answer these kinds of explanations, they say, no, these are not good explanations. Polar bears are white because the sun bleaches them. It's also not a good explanation, but that one is not teleological, right? That's a mechanistic kind of explanation. It's a bad mechanistic. So you've got bad teleological explanations, you've got bad mechanistic explanations. But then what Kellerman does is takes, randomly assigns people to,
Sorry.
what's going on? Now, randomly assigns them to different conditions, whether they have to have all the time they like to answer, or if they have to answer very quickly. And when they have to answer quickly, within, I think it was 3,200 milliseconds, then they start affirming, they start saying that those teleological bad answers are good answers. Okay? So the teleological ones start looking pretty good if you have to answer quickly. You might have felt some of that reading these. They didn't seem quite as pop out as bad as this one did, as the polar bears being bleached. There's something about them that rings, that seems a little bit right. Oh, no, wait, I see what you're doing there. All right? But actually, their accuracy on things like polar bears are white because the sun bleaches them, that accuracy rate goes up when they're sped up. All right? Like, they're not second-guessing themselves. Their accuracy actually goes up. And she's recently replicated this study with Chinese university-educated adults as well. Okay? So it looks like we've got cross-cultural replication. So putting together these various studies, it looks like teleological reasoning is just there turning around in the background, and what we learn to do is override it and stamp it down. Okay. So there's this bias to think that there's at least one, maybe many creators out there who account for the design and purpose that we intuitively see in the natural world. A human isn't a good candidate for that, but maybe the creator is human-like in all other respects. Just not a human, but sort of like a human in other respects. A little bit like Douglas Adams' sort of view of how the world was created. This is from Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy. So our Earthling, Arthur, is discovered that the Earth was made in a factory, okay, somewhere far away. Are you trying to tell me, said Arthur slowly and with control, that you originally made the Earth? Oh yes, said Slartibartfast. Did you ever go to a place, I think it was called Norway? No, said Arthur, no I didn't. Pity, said Slartibartfast. That was one of mine. One reward, lovely twinkly edges. Okay, so maybe this is the way children are thinking, is that the creators are human-like, but not human, but don't really have any other kinds of interesting divine properties. And that's where my lab's work sort of jumps in. Because we've started looking at, over the last, 15 years, we've been looking at, are there other sort of super-making properties that are also easy for children to grab a hold of, hang on to? Or are these super properties that are often attributed to gods, like being super knowing, super perceiving, and immortal, conceptual difficulties for children? Or on the other hand, are they really simple? Are they part of that sort of God-shaped space that makes it easy for kids to be in? And one of the tasks that we've done to explore this is a familiar task in the world of cognitive development. It's a form of the false belief task. It's called a surprising contents false belief task. It was designed to measure when is it that children understand that beliefs don't just map onto the world one for one, but they can actually be false. They are representations of the way someone perceives the world to be. So how does the task go? You get presented with a familiar container, like a cracker box here, and children are asked, so what kind of box is this? You can be the child now, just say. So it's a cracker box. Yeah, let's get an audience participation. Cracker box, that's right. Okay, that's right, it is a cracker box. What do you think is inside of it?
Crackers.
Crackers. This is easy, all right. And then I open the box and show you that I've taken the crackers out, and I've put rocks in the box. Okay? You look shocked, or, oh no, why did I get crackers? I tricked you. I'm going to close the box back up and then show you again. All right, what's inside the box? Rocks, that's right. There are rocks in the box. I took the crackers out and I put rocks in the box. Now, if your mom came in the room right now and she saw this closed box, just like this, for the first time, what would she think is inside the box?
Crackers.
Right. You adults in the room would say crackers. The typical 3-year-old says rocks. Okay? At 3, children seem to have difficulty with the notion that beliefs can be false. For them, it looks like beliefs are what they know to be reality. Beliefs are, in a sense, infallible. Sounds a little godlike. But the question we've asked is, well, how do children answer with regard to God? Because if the Piagetians, people following in Piaget's footsteps, are right, and God's just another human until kids are about 8 or 9 years old, they should answer just the same as they do for mom. Okay? So that's what we checked out. Our y-axis here is the percentage of kids answering crackers, and therefore passing the task. Otherwise, they said rocks, which would be failing the task. The red line here represents the rates at which they're answering crackers for mother. We've got 3, 4, 5, and 6-year-old children. These were American children in this particular study. These other little lines along here are tree, snake, elephant, and bear. I just wanted to see how flexible are they with this kind of reasoning. You can actually sort of probably even see from where you are that these lines are all statistically indistinguishable from each other. So mom, elephant, bear, tree, and snake were all treated the same way. Okay? This bold line across the bottom is how they answered for God. Okay, so what you see here is that the 3 and 4-year-old children said everybody would think there are rocks in the box. The 5 and 6-year-old children said all of these other agents would think there are crackers in the box. They'd be wrong. They'd be deceived by the appearance, but God wouldn't be. Okay? So, a couple of things to note. One, well before children are 8 or 9 years old, they're distinguishing between God and their mom in terms of God's knowledge access. All right? They're not treating God just like a human being. So at least some kids are capable of this. I'm not going to say that every kid, the first time they hear the word God, are going to make this distinction. But these kids certainly did. The other thing to note here is that the starting point is assuming everybody knows. Okay? So this yellow line is actually statistically flat line. Kids didn't learn anything about God here, it looks like, in this test. I think they did, but it's not changing how they answer. So to get God right, just keep answering the way you did when you were 3. To get mom right, you better learn something important here. Some change has to take place. Okay? It takes 2 more years to get mom right compared to God. We've replicated this with Mayan children. On the Yucatan Peninsula, instead of a cracker box, you have to use a familiar container for this kind of task. Used a tortilla gourd. Need a surprising content. Used underwear. No one saw that coming. They didn't expect underwear in the tortilla gourd. Same kind of pattern. The 4, except that we got a slight age shift. 4-year-olds are thinking everybody would know that there were underpants in the tortilla gourd. By 7, they know mom or a human being here represented by a doll would not know that, but God would. Interestingly, I didn't put it on this slide, but we also asked about other deities, okay, because these are polytheistic children. They know about the Catholic God, sun God, forest spirits, all kinds of different things, and we asked about a number of them. 4 years old, even the ones that all the adults regard as really dopey, okay, still know that there are underpants in the tortilla gourd. Okay, even the forest spirits who are not in the house but are out in the forest, they would think that there are underpants in the tortilla gourd. By 7 years old, the smart God knows that there are underwear in the tortilla gourd, and the ones out in the forest or the ones that aren't very smart would be fooled. Okay, so they start distinguishing amongst the different gods too by the time they're 7 years old. We've recently replicated this with the Chinese, a sample not looking at gods per se, but at mythical superhuman characters. Sun Wukong, the Jade Emperor, and Guayan Bodhisattva. All right, they're all sort of super knowledgeable, but not quite, omniscient, at least from an adult perspective. And in Ecuador, looked at Santa Claus, an angel, and Virgin Mary. But here we used what's called an ignorance task, and this is a slight wrinkle on that. One of the objections that some of our critics have made to this research is that kids are sort of overwhelmed by, they've got a curse of knowledge. Once they know that there are rocks in the box, they're just sort of, it's just so exciting to them that they just kind of insert that in. What did somebody else know? Oh, no, rocks, it's rocks, you know. And there's something to that. You ask the kids themselves, did you ever think there were crackers in the cracker box? And the 3-year-olds go, no. No. So before I opened the box, what did you think was inside? Rocks. You show them a videotape of themselves saying crackers. You ask them, why did you say crackers? And they often just confabulate. I was kidding, it was a joke. They don't seem to know their own minds in that respect. So, new task, we're going to put them in an ignorance condition. So, we're going to take an unmarked box. We're going to take 2 toys. Okay, so I've got a red circular one, I've got a yellow pentagonal one. I'm going to secretly put one in the box, and I'm going to put one in my pocket. And I'm going to close this up so that you can't see what's inside. And you can hear that there's one in there. Can you see inside the box? Do you know which toy is in the box? Yeah. Do you really know, or do you just think you have a good guess? We have to do this with one kid, I think. Okay, and then ask the same questions. Now, once I don't know what's in the box. They're in an ignorance condition. Would your mom know what's in the box? Would a friend know what's in the box? Would Sun Wukong know what's in the box? Would Santa Claus know what's in the box? Okay? So what might we predict? Well, if all children are doing is being egocentric about this, that is, I know, or I don't know, or whatever it is, and that's what I'm going to apply to everybody, well, this is what they should be answering, is down here on this end. I don't know, so no one else knows. All right, that'd be the sort of egocentric strategy. And in this case, it's a really good strategy for getting humans right, because other humans wouldn't know, right? I mean, nobody knows except me, for sure, which one's in the box in this room. So a good guess is no one else knows. I don't know, no one else knows. Okay? But if it's the case that children have some kind of default for over-attributing knowledge to others, we'd expect a pattern more like this, where when it comes to all agents, the youngest children are going to err towards saying, no, they'd know. I don't know, but they would know. And then with time, they're going to learn that for humans, oh, I guess mom wouldn't know, actually. Okay? But with the superhuman agents, they should continue up high. All right? And so these are our results from China. Much more in keeping with what I've called the preparedness hypothesis. That is, there's this natural tendency to over-attribute knowledge. Okay? Even when the children themselves are ignorant, they're not attributing ignorance. They're more likely to attribute knowledge. This is Sun Wukong here, and you see you do get a sort of an uptick here as they're getting older, and this is what they were answering for a parent. All right? Starting high, dropping down to attributing ignorance by around 5 years. Okay? Same thing for Ecuador, a little bit messier, but similar kind of pattern here. With the red line now is the angel, and here's what the parents are doing. And yeah, you're seeing this right, that actually at 3 years old, they're actually attributing a little bit more knowledge to the parent than to an angel. I don't think it's statistically significant, if I remember right. That could be just due to a small sample size. All right, but anyway, starting high and moving down for the human, but staying flat and high for the angel. All right. We've also done other kinds of mind tasks. For the sake of time, I'll go through this. This is just a memory task. We see a similar kind of thing. When a child has forgotten something, they're more likely to attribute ignorance or forgetting to a dog, mom, and God in that order. But see, God actually, they are disinclined to say God has forgotten anything. These are kids under 6 years old from Israel. Just looking at kids only under 4 years old, even the very youngest kids are reluctant to say God has forgotten something, even when they themselves have. They're happy to say a dog has, mom is somewhere in the mushy middle. So, before moving on to immortality, so what we see in these kinds of tasks, and we run perception tasks having to do with visual acuity, seeing in the dark, smelling, hearing things, all of these tasks, we see over and over again this pattern of children giving the benefit of the doubt to others. And it doesn't matter which others. 3-year-olds tend to think others know, hear, see, smell, and remember. And then they learn where the limitations are on perceptual abilities, on mental abilities, on memory, and so forth. Okay? So they start by the sort of super attributions, and then they have to learn otherwise. Okay? So you can see that gods who fit that kind of profile actually are closer to the natural default position of the 3-year-old child. You don't have to learn as much for them. Immortality might go in a similar direction. I put it that way because the data are not as strong and not as consistent here, but they're still interesting. Just one slide here. This is from my former student at Oxford, Emma Burdett's work in Israel, south of Jerusalem. These are children from an area that human death is very familiar to them. And she asked a number of questions pertaining to mortality, but I'm giving you the simplest version. And that was a question simply, will your mother, friend, God, go on living forever and ever, or will they eventually die? Which one? Will they die, or will they go on living forever? And it says younger half. Here, children are ranging in age from 3 to 6. Old 6-year-olds, young 3-year-olds. Splitting it in half, the younger half are kids 4.5 years old and younger. And the other half are 4.5 up through 6. Okay? And the younger half, you see about half the time, these 29 kids, they said that their friend would never die. 12 of 29 said their mom would never die. 20 of 29 said God would never die. Okay, so they're kind of confused about whether mom or a friend would die. They're not confused that God won't die. And the oldest kids in this group are 4.5 years old. By the time we get to the second group, where you've got 4.5 to 6-year-olds, everybody's clear, okay, my friend will eventually die 25 out of 27. Mom will die 26 out of 27. And 26 out of 28 answering said God would not die. Okay? So kids are showing an earlier understanding, or at least answering that way, of God's immortality than of human mortality. And again, we recently replicated this in China. It looks like we're getting similar data there. And talking to some of my other developmental psych colleagues in various places, they say this is the common, sort of a common pattern. It looks like children have to learn that people are eventually going to die. In some ways, that's not too surprising. But it's easier for them just to assume we just keep going on the way we have been. Okay? So I think a lot of these features add up to a conceptual space that is readily filled by something like a God. But you might wonder, well, what about this invisibility thing? Isn't it odd to think about invisible agents, invisible beings? And I think the answer actually is no. This isn't odd. There's nothing particularly difficult about it. And what's my evidence there? Well, Marjorie Taylor has done a lot of work looking at children's imaginary friends. And at least she finds that by the time kids are about 7 years old, I believe it's 65% of kids have had an imaginary friend. Mostly this is in the preschool years. These are not odd kids. Okay, 65%, that's so the majority. And actually, if anything, it goes the other way. Kids who do not have imaginary friends are probably at higher risk for certain kinds of social developmental problems. It's a perfectly normal, natural thing to have invisible friends. So it's pretty clear that even in the preschool years, kids can talk and think about the beliefs, desires, and actions of somebody they can't see. Not surprising, given that we also have data from infant studies, like this Philippe Rashad, among others, that in the first year of life, so kids 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 months old, can treat colored discs moving on a computer screen as if they are intentional agents with goals, with intentions. That is, this system is really easy to get going. You don't need three-dimensional bodies present to get the system going. And of course, you shouldn't need that. Because what kind of a handicap would it be in terms of fitness if we have to be able to see other people in order to reason about their potential mental states and reason about them as agents? You better be able to reason about them even when they are invisible, say because of bad lighting conditions, or because they're using camouflage, or they're just out of the room. Okay, so actually invisibility not a problem. And interestingly, Bradley Wigger has been replicating some of these tasks that I've just been showing you, the cracker box test, the ignorance condition test, with 3 to 5-year-olds in various countries of the world. These aren't all of them he's done, United States, Kenya, and Malawi, but there are 3 representative ones. And he finds this general pattern that by the time children are 4 years old, they're distinguishing among which agents would know and which ones wouldn't. And they all start by sort of attributing knowledge to all of them. In one of his samples, he actually finds that even the 3-year-olds are treating God as most knowing. Okay? I believe that was the Malawi sample. All right, but the patterns are pretty much the same across cultures, and that is that children start by attributing knowledge to everybody. By the time they're 5, they're doing these nice, clean discriminations about who would know and who wouldn't. God would know. Invisible friends are an interesting case, because he also asked, would your invisible friend know? Okay, so when kids had invisible friends, and in the first sample, the American sample, he specifically was targeting kids who did have invisible friends. Would your invisible friends know? And what he's finding is that the youngest children, again, assume their invisible friends would know. Know what's in the box, all right? Be able to see in the dark. Be able to perceive that faint little thing written on that card across the room. Invisible friends seem to be godlike in their properties. And they're actually some of the last ones. Even the 5-year-olds are still giving them super properties. Okay? It's extremely unlikely that children have been indoctrinated to think that there are invisible friends who have divine properties. Right? You see that? That just seems implausible. You know, mom saying, you know what, you have an invisible friend, her name is Jane, and she can see anything in this room, under any lighting condition. No, it looks like that's just the way children's minds go. It's the path of least resistance. Okay, so children seem to naturally assume that the world is purposeful and designed. They see it everywhere. God, of some sort, is not, but not humans, is a suitable creator or designer for that apparent purpose and design. And their developmental default is that all intentional agents are super knowing, at least from a moral perspective, and they have to learn that it's not true of humans. All intentional agents are super perceiving. They have to learn that it isn't true of humans. All intentional agents are immortal. I'll say perhaps. We must learn that that isn't true of humans. And invisibility, not a problem. Because of these assumptions, children can reason accurately about some of God's properties earlier than they reason about humans on the same dimensions, and they may readily understand, acquire, and believe in God concepts that approximate those assumptions. I put it that way because some gods don't. Right? Some gods are really dumb, they're visible, and they can die. Okay? They exist in folklore. But gods that approximate this conceptual space, right, are really easy for kids to adopt. That's my born believers thesis. But does that mean children are born to believe? All right, that they've been designed in such a way that they should believe. Let me just note that having natural propensities is not the same as being designed by natural selection for religious belief. Okay, so some folks will think, oh, so is believing in God's an adaptation then? Right, that we've been endowed through evolution to believe in God. So now we're going to search for exactly why that is. And some of my colleagues think it really is adaptive to believe in gods of some sort. And I'm not denying that. I'm just pointing out that you need not go there logically. It may be the case, and I lean this direction, that those mechanisms that I'm talking about, that theory of mind system, thinking about other people's minds, for instance, that scene design in the natural world, all of those are there to solve certain kinds of adaptive problems. Those are there to enhance fitness, if you can use the team in that sense. And God is an emergent property of those. Okay? Being receptive to thinking about God is an emergent property of those cognitive propensities. That's the way I tend to go. One could argue, though, look, it turns out it's really good to believe in God. It's good for your fitness. Why? Some have suggested that fear of supernatural punishment will make you behave better, which will make you a more trustworthy exchange, trade partner, and so forth. You reap benefits from that. We get along better as a community if we're all trusting each other. We're trusting each other because we all think that there's a God who's going to whack us if we misbehave. Okay, so the story might go something along those lines. That's a different argument. Okay, and I'm not going to talk about that right now. Note that also saying that there are natural propensities toward belief is not the same as saying that we're designed by God, even if it be a natural selection for religious belief. Okay, you need not draw that conclusion. In fact, lots of us working in my area are sympathetic toward what's called the naturalness of religion thesis, that there's something very natural about supernatural thinking. And most of us in this area are not believers, we're not theists, okay? But, so there's a recognition at this point. I say, but, that means there's another slide coming. It's not inconsistent with a belief that we are born to believe either. These data actually seem to resonate with certain kinds of theological propositions that have been in many traditions, including the Christian tradition, for a long time. And here's just one example. This is a quote from John Calvin, talking about what's known as the sensus divinitatis, the sense of the divine. There is within the human mind, and indeed by natural instinct, an awareness of divinity. This we take to be beyond controversy. We, I suppose, is him. God himself has implanted in all men a certain understanding of his divine majesty. That there is some God is naturally inborn in all, and is fixed deep within, as it were, in the very marrow. I sometimes joke this was John Calvin commenting on cognitive science and religion. Except that you might have noted I didn't say inborn. I talked about natural propensities, but then you got me inborn. But my point in sharing this slide is theists need not be surprised by these findings. If one, for theological reasons or other reasons, has an inclination to believe that God has created the cosmos and created us, maybe via natural selection, to have some kind of a relationship with God, then we might expect that he might reveal something to us all through natural processes, that it might be part of our human endowment to at least very rapidly and easily acquire belief in God. If that's your theological inclination, here are some data that seem to fit that. You need not know that way, but at least that's one way to tell the story. Thank you very much.
Indeed, Justin. Well, we've got some good time now for questions and discussion. I'm going to sort of take the room here in sort of two halves, just because we have a mic coming around, and I'd just be grateful if you could raise your hand and wait till the mic comes so we can pick it up on the tape. So we're going to start over on my left-hand side for first questions over here. So please, over to you for questions and discussion. Thank you. And if nobody's going to raise their hand, over there. Okay, so we'll go with that. Thanks.
Thanks very much. I wondered if you'd like to comment on the belief there seems to be amongst pre-scientific communities, should we say, that, for example, things like sickness are purposive, in your sort of language. Science comes along later, perhaps, and offers an alternative, and most of us would think better explanation. But certainly, right through cultures where scientific understanding isn't there seems, at least from my casual observation, to be this kind of sense that people are sick, because someone else wants you to be sick, because you've done something wrong, you're being punished, and so on. I just wondered if you'd like to comment on that within this sort of framework.
Sure, yeah, that's right. Well, thank you. And I think that is resonant with what I was sharing. Children do have, actually it looks like, I should put it this way, from childhood we all have a propensity to try to understand why things happen, right, to make meaning of these sorts of situations. And we seem to be very strongly disposed, most of us, again, not all, but most of us, toward finding these intentional explanations, especially when the causal pathways are not obvious, right? So the obvious mechanistic pathway, so no problem, I knocked the box over. Everyone doesn't need to go searching for an explanation of how the box fell over, but if it just falls over right now, without me touching it, we're going, oh, our mind's automatically going, okay, what happened there? All right, we're going to search out for an explanation. With a lot of illnesses, crop failures, the rains aren't coming the right time, where you've got complex causal systems, it's hard to just intuitively see what the causal mechanisms are. We tend to default to intentional kinds of explanations. That's right. And so gods, spirits, witchcraft are very easily inserted in there. One of the interesting things, I mean, you mentioned how scientific explanations can come in and displace those. There's something peculiar about that in two ways. One is that, of course, speaking strictly philosophically, they need not displace. You can have multiple explanations at the same time. Just like actually the box fell over because I intended to knock it over, the mechanism was me punching it, right? So identifying the mechanism doesn't sort of absolve us of paying attention to intentions. But the other thing is, from our recent project in China, the work of Melanie Nyhoff, it looks like there's some hint of evidence that children have to learn to think that you can't have two explanations at the same time. That's one of the things that we learn. And one of the things, actually, I think our science education fails us in doing is we often, one of the good things about science education is it just teaches us how the world works, but it also often does it at a cost of recognizing that you can have multiple levels of causation at the same time. Those of us who are science champions often, at least rhetorically, make it sound like a scientific explanation is always preferable under every condition. And so we actually discourage kids from embracing multiple explanations at the same time. Like, yeah, we got sick because of this pathogen, but somebody meant to put it in the water supply, for instance. That's a good question. Thank you.
Thank you. Any other questions on the side? So, yes, at the back row, please.
Well, this side gets time to think, really.
They get time to think. Their time will come.
You were saying like the daughter of your friend thinks God is an elderly woman, and you also said children learn that God, people die, but God won't die, and God is super knowing, God is super perceiving. Do children learn that God is actually not a human form, like human-like things, or?
Yeah, good.
We can't imagine God without a human form.
Right, well, that's a very good question. I mean, I could sort of cop out and say, I don't know. And there's some truth to that. It's certainly the case that the details with regard to how God is going to look, what I refer to as sort of the color of the God shape, is going to be culturally specified. Okay, so children need to be taught those things. I've certainly argued nowhere that children naturally believe, for instance, that there's only one God. That children naturally believe in some kind of Trinitarian God, for instance. No. An atemporal, God outside of time. There are all kinds of properties of gods that certainly have to be taught. And you need a certain amount of conceptual resources that I don't think young children have to learn those properties. So you certainly need to be taught some of these things. And until you have those kinds of conceptual resources, of course, there's going to be a tendency toward comparing God to things that we know. And we see that in adulthood, right? Adults anthropomorphize God. We talk about, I mean, even those of us who might not strictly believe that God has hands, we'll talk about the hand of God. Or that God has eyes, and we'll talk about, his eye is on the sparrow. So that anthropomorphic language, that human-like language, does seem to be a very easy thing to do. And part of that is, I speculate, twofold. One, it's conceptually easy. Two, it's conceptually easy because children are not immersed in more theologically rich concepts early. Okay, that they missed a developmental opportunity. One of the things that developmental psychologists know is there are these sensitive or critical periods for acquiring certain kinds of capacities, like say music or language, where a little bit of investment early in life pays off greater dividends than a greater investment later in life. And I actually suspect theological reasoning is one of those areas.
Okay, I think we'll move over this side if we may. Gentlemen up here, thanks very much. And please, the middle, feel you can ask questions as well. So. Thank you.
You began by referencing your colleague's 3-year-old child who was being brought up in an atheist household and yet declared this concept of God, an elderly female. Was there any significance or change or any important factors in particularly older children who would have had some kind of socialisation from the parents and or from a church teaching background or any faith background, that they were more inclined to speak of a God in positive terms? And similarly, for those children who have been brought up, like your colleagues, in a non-faith-based socialisation background, were they more inclined to disbelieve in God?
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, don't misunderstand me. I'm not saying that parental influences don't matter, that cultural influences don't matter. I use this anecdote to illustrate that they're not the whole story. Okay? In this case, my colleague, who is a developmental psychologist, he really, at least what he reports to me, is that he couldn't figure out where the influence was. He couldn't. But surely the child has heard the word God, or in whatever language, I mean in the language of this country, in order to know, to be able to use that. So there had to be some kind of exposure somewhere. My point is that it appears, at least from this father's testimony, that it was very slight, and yet the concept stuck. That's the interesting thing. It's not that there's no exposure. Again, it's in some ways analogous to language, right? The way that children rapidly acquire language is pretty remarkable. It's not that there wasn't any linguistic input and that they invented language all by themselves. I guess there are some maybe apocryphal stories in that line, but and there are in religion as well. Apparently, for instance, Helen Keller reports that before she knew how to communicate with the outside world, she was already wondering who made this stuff in the natural world, for instance. So there, at least some of these exist, but really the answer is no, I don't know. Surely there was a good clarification.
Thank you. Question down here, please. I'm going to look at the front row. So, gentleman in the second row. If you could keep your hand up so we can see for the microphone. Thank you very much. Yeah.
Thanks for the talk. So, why do you think that the conceptual space that you're talking of exists in the child's mind? And why do you disregard the alternate possibility that that conceptual space gets created by the culture? Now, you will say that because it's so easy, you take the example of language. Now, the language comes very easy because there is an innate kind of schema or some kind of structure in child's mind. Now, things which permeate in culture can also become easy to grasp. For example, writing nowadays, or take, for example, using a tablet interface with your hand, something which is very new, and all very small children will easily pick that up. So now, the latter two examples, writing and using a smartphone, are examples which are easy to grasp, but come to be so because of the culture, right?
Well, no, those are interesting examples. And it's certainly the case that children appear to be able to learn, for instance, how to read and write faster than adults. But that doesn't mean it's not the case that children actually have to struggle quite a bit to learn to write, for instance, and have to receive a lot of direct tuition, and have to receive instruction and practice in doing this. One of my colleagues, so it falls in the category of what Bob Macaulay, philosopher of science, cognitive science, and works in this area, calls practice naturalness, where it requires special cultural conditions, artifacts, writing implements, instruction, tutoring. And you don't see that in, say, language acquisition. Okay? Children don't just learn their language by being told how to conjugate verbs. That's the way we teach older kids to do it. They learn it by just being exposed to it. So it's what he calls maturationally natural learning. So there seems to be a different kind of learning process going on. And that, I think, is one of the differences. It doesn't look like you need special artifacts, special cultural conditions. By special, I mean that we don't all share. For kids to pick up religious ideas. Now, the particular religious ideas, again, of course, are going to be culturally specific. So that's part of why I lean away from they're just really good cultural sponges. The other reason why I move away from that is, well, a couple of things. One is the cross-cultural ubiquity of religious beliefs has to be accounted for. And just appealing to a culture doesn't explain that kind of thing, right? That's part of it. Some of the evidence that I'm appealing to as well, for instance, Kelman's work on design, right? She's showing that kids are using explanations for natural things that are purposeful and sometimes intentional in areas that their parents don't say and do not approve of. And that's another difference between this kind of thinking and, say, writing or use of tablets or these other kinds of things where parents have put these into their hands and said, yeah, this is what you do. But I like your examples. The tablet use is a really fun and sort of perplexing one. I mean, some of you have probably seen this. You know, little 2-year-olds who have gotten used to using the tablet, and then they get to a book or something and it's not working right. They see something in the world and they get frustrated because they can't just wipe it away. And, those tablets were cleverly designed to really fit well the way kids' minds work naturally. Design it in a different way, it's not going to work nearly as well. The designers were very clever.
Weren't they designed by cognitive psychologists?
Well, there's that.
I mean,
right.
probably, I think they might
but what they
input there.
Yeah.
So there's a question in front. Thank you. Yes.
Hi, thank you for a wonderful talk. So initially, your child's development of theory of mind kind of puts most other agents on the same level, mum, God, friend, whatever. And then as the child gets older, they discriminate. And properties are both, the super attributes are assigned to God, and also the ones that have been assigned to other figures are modulated down to what the child understands to be normal.
Right.
At what stage, and I would love you to hear your comments on how you think this develops, do other attributes get assigned to a deity in a child's mind? So you start off, God is omnipotent, omniscient, immortal. At what point does the child start thinking about things like benevolence?
Oh, yeah. Oh, that's a good one. Benevolence is a great one. I would love to see somebody study that. But I haven't seen it yet. I mean, in this kind of way, starting very young. With benevolence, I have a hunch that this constellation of other features makes it easy to believe in that a God is sort of genuinely good. But I suspect the factors there are not as much cognitive as they are social. Okay, so one of the things that developmental psychologists of religion have shown is that children are more inclined to adopt the beliefs of their parents, the theological beliefs of their parents, the religious practices of their parents, including denominational affiliation and so forth, if they have a secure attachment to their parents, for instance. They trust their parents. They don't find their parents capricious, and so forth. Well, then they tend to trust God too, and they tend to have that same relationship. A kid who is anxious in their attachment to their parents is more likely to have to rebel against that at a certain point and move to another religion or give up on religion altogether. These other attributes, it's hard to generalize because I suspect that it has a lot to do with how difficult the attribute is. So I already mentioned, God as a trinity, 3 persons in one. Well, I think that one's difficult for adults to sort of wrestle with. And at a certain point, we bracket that as my community believes this, and I trust them enough to say, yeah, I'm going to accept that, even if I don't completely understand it. And I imagine a lot of divine attributes work along those lines. What's interesting about them is we can't hold them all in mind at the same time, so they don't do a lot of work for us in real time.
So my follow-on question, if I could be cheeky and ask it, is...
Yes, please do. Please, if you use
Yes, please be cheeky.
If a child is, and it is if, a child is basing its conception of God as something that is nurturing and very powerful and essentially indistinguishable from other figures like that in the child's background. To what extent does the early background shape the child's relationship to God?
Yeah, thanks, quite a bit. It sure looks that way. Beyond that sort of attachment to parents, it's also, there's evidence that in terms of the character of God, which I think you're referring to, is God good or bad, trustworthy, wrathful, and so forth, those attributes tend to correlate very strongly with the way the child views their parents. So the child need not necessarily give up on God, but might, if a parent is sort of capricious and hostile, but is more inclined to think God is too. It used to be thought, the old Freudian line was that kids thought of God the way they thought of their fathers, and then there was sort of a swing toward mothers as being the sort of primary. Now it looks like it's a hybrid between the two primary caregivers, depending on who, proportionate to who's investing more and so forth. But you're quite right. That initial investment in the relationship that children have with parents characterizes their relationship with God in many cases.
We'll take one more question, I think. Emma, zoom back that way to Duncan. Can you zoom right from the back row there? Thanks so much. And then we'll draw stumps, which is a cricketing analogy, by the way. Henry's way to finish.
I didn't know cricket ever finished.
Okay. It's a quick one.
Thanks for a really great talk. I wondered whether you considered the extent to which other kinds of cognitive processes will impinge on the kinds of beliefs that young children have. So, young children's cognitive processes are very limited, and so to ascribe some kind of physical or mechanistic explanation for things requires far greater online processing resources than maybe an explanation of saying, well, it's that way because God did it. I wonder whether you consider that, or whether maybe that's part of your argument that you're saying, well, there's a reason, one of the reasons that we're predisposed to believe in God is because we find it simpler. The cognitive demands of believing something else, at least when you're a very young child, are simply too great, and that is why children are born believers.
Yeah, I don't think that's inconsistent with what I'm saying. I'm arguing that there's something, because of the way our minds are, there's something easier about, there's something relatively easy thinking about intentions being behind certain complex features of or events in the natural world. I think that's right. But note that our minds didn't have to be that way. So I sometimes draw the analogy with, say, these kinds of computers. Let's for a moment, without anyone getting hostile, let me say that our minds are computers. That's frowned upon in some places, but we certainly do computational kind of work with our brains. But it's very different than these kinds of computers here, these personal PCs. A good example, again, is language. These things are actually rather full of language, natural languages, like English. It's very good with binary code. For instance, submersing a child in binary code communication would probably be a disaster. They're not necessarily going to pick that up. Likewise, I mentioned faces earlier. In recent years now, computers are getting pretty good at picking out human faces in a visual field and so forth, but they're not very good actually at identifying, they're getting better, at identifying human faces, the same human face, say, from 1,000 different angles, whereas your average infant does it just like that. What those examples, I think, show is that whether something is easy or difficult depends on which computer we're talking about, what kind of mind we're talking about. And in this case, it just so happens that our minds are really good at thinking in terms of intentional causes for things, even if that cause is an invisible meaning. And so you're quite right. These complex kinds of causal structures like illness, where a certain animal came from, thunderstorms and so forth, well, it's a lot easier to think someone did it. Thank you.